Thank you very much. I think this type of initiatives are very, very important. We need to be very creative, as we were talking before the initiation of the formal meeting, in order to develop alternatives of resistance and initiatives in order to push forward the positions and the needs of the peoples. Because unfortunately, and that will be the topic of my presentation. This has been a very convenient uh, situation for the big capitals. We are in the middle of a kind of blitzkrieg against the populations, especially populations in the south, poor populations, the most vulnerable populations everywhere. And I'll try to set up the situation in Latin America in the middle of this agenda of speculative monopolistic capital. And this is a very specific definition. It's not financial capital itself, is a very tiny fraction of financial capital, a kind of irreversible evolution of financial capital, monopolistic financial capital, not directly linked to production, is a kind of a derivation of financial capital linked to speculation. For financial capital in the sense of Hilferding, what you need is the success of the subjacent productive projects. And that includes the deployment of markets. That requires, for example, I don't know, Keynesian policies, redistributive policies in order to expand markets. For speculative financial capital, you have a different political and power project linked to the difficulties of payments. That was a kind of general rehearsal during the 80s, last century, through the IMF and the World Bank conditionality, cross-conditionality. They never expected the poor countries to pay the debt. They only wanted to blackmail the countries in order to leverage their agenda, the neoliberal agenda, in order to make more profitable the short-term investment, the short-term speculative investment, and to transform the axis, the center of gravity of those economies towards the needs of this very liquid, in the sense of Sigmund Baumann's definition, but from the roots, the power roots, the economic roots of this type of civilizational features. So in order to make much more liquid the opportunities of investment for financial capital, the leverage that they reach out of public indebtedness, but also private indebtedness, external indebtedness in general, because it's mostly related to indebtedness in a non-produced currency that created the conditions that we are today. After this long period, 40 years, 30 years, depending on the country, that was not an endogenous situation, was a part of the geopolitical agenda, in which it was not the invisible hand, it was the manu militari, the previous regime of accumulation based upon the import substitution industrialization was suffocated through the sequestration, the kidnapping, the killings, the repression in the South Cone and the Plan Condor, as a very clear economic agenda to deindustrialize those countries in order to weaken the power of the working classes that had been gaining different strengths of different type of strength according to the historical and cultural trajectory in each country. Peronismo in Argentina, Traballismo in Brazil, Allende in Chile, Frente Amplio in Uruguay, and that was a kind of menace, a political menace that was resolved through. Did I have any problem with my audio? Okay, let's continue. So what you have in Latin America, it was not only the economic agenda, but also the political agenda as a kind of political experiment with the neoliberal policies that were later introduced by Thatcher and Reagan in the North. Previously, the type of political management of the rebellion in Latin America occurred in Central America and the Caribbean. And it was basically linked to repression, pure and simple repression. This political cycle was successful for the American imperialism in the cases of Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, but Cuba came, and it was a big shaking of the strategists in the United States. So the conjunction of these economic policies as a mechanism of political tame, it was very successful after Chile, after Argentina, and in a kind of mixture because of the specificity of the Brazilian sub-imperialism, a mixture between the development of productive forces supported by the nationalist sectors of the armed force in the dictatorship, and the control and the political taming of the population through repression and political control, political co-optation. So what we have since the beginning of this millennium is resurrection, basically in South America, of a new type of left agenda linked to the class alliances with the more modern fractions of the bourgeoisie in order to take advantage of the cycle of raw materials, the international trade cycle provoked by the ascension of China, but this time in a very different horizon with respect to what happened during the import substitution industrialization, because of the massive destruction of productive forces and the weakening of the historical subject. There is no national bourgeoisies in any country, not even in Brazil, for example, larger economy by far in South America, capable to perform or to deploy a project of internal market construction in terms of sovereignty, in terms of income distribution, in terms of autonomy vis-a-vis the American imperialism. But of course, we have a different situation in terms of a renegotiation of our dependency with respect both to the ascension of China, the relationship with Europe, and the renegotiation of the backyard role with respect to the United States. And during this process, every country with different specificities, different characteristics, in which the progressive forces gain the government, deployed a massive effort in terms of income distribution, both the direct and the indirect income distribution, through the social policies, the construction of infrastructure, and the systematic stimulus to the internal market through Keynesian, the old Keynesian policies. Unfortunately, without the support of what was at that time proposed as the new regional financial architecture that was designed precisely to curb the dependency and the limits of this type of efforts within the yoke of the financial and monetary American imperialism. That means the monopoly that the dollar, the global monopoly that the dollar has on liquidity, transactionality, credit, and the financial safety net linked to precisely this speculative capital was going to strangle sooner or later the efforts of transformation in the Latin American economies in which you have these progressive governments. Due to the new relations of force, even right-wing governments like those in Chile or Colombia were pressured to deploy also progressive policies, especially in terms of the labor market and in terms of social policies in this very racketical welfare state. You have significant advances in all Latin America, both in South America, in which was the epicenter of the pink wave, and also in Central America and Mexico. Mexico was very important, but at the same time you have this kind of underground advance of the neoliberal policies, both in South America, but and much more openly in Mexico and Central America, and in those countries in which the right-wing governments control the situation anyway. So all this must be framed into the global crisis of overproduction. Capitalism has this cyclical crisis linked to the so-called Kondratiev waves, in which is not only the normal cycle, kind of 7 to 11 years cycle of investment that provokes a cyclical crisis of overproductions, but it is also a long-term situation in which the technological paradigm had created an impossible situation for the expression of those new productive forces in terms of the social relationships. This time, the situation of capital is different. The cyclicality has been affected because the nature of the improvements, the technical improvements, had shown the historical limits of the value form in terms of the capitalist mechanisms of transformation, of reinventing itself. It has been the case in previous cycles. This time you have a continuous technical and scientific revolution embedded in the previous technical and scientific revolution without stop. And the Keynesian and Fordist solutions that were so effective in previous times and that had been deployed differentially from the center. First, the New Deal in the United States, the reconstruction in the social democratic reconstruction in Europe, the counterinsurgent situation in Japan, and the non-communist controlled economies in Asia. Deployed this the magic of this oxygen injected in the current capacity of capitalism, the endogenous current capacity of capitalism, not related to the ecology, had reached some limits, even after the tremendous, the massive injection that signified the incorporation of first the Soviet sphere, and in the aftermath, the very rapid growth of the communist China. So this evolution in Latin America must be related to the conditions imposed by the contradictory needs of the center of the empire, and more specifically, the situation of dependency with the United States. The expansion of the external sector during the last 20 years, or at least the first 15 years of the new millennium, was kind of challenge to the situation, to the previous offensive, the previous neoliberal offensive of the empire, and it created a tension in which important segments of the American capital, of the Anglo-American capital, agreed to participate in a process of market creation within each one of the countries with these reformist policies. At some point after the financial implosion of this parasitarian hypertrophy of the speculative apparatus in 2008, it was very clear that capital at the center required significant transformation of the relationship between finance and capital, especially productive capital, due to the fall of the rate of profit. This time, again, the Keynesian and Fordist measures in order to inject more oxygen in the productive capital, in the profitability of the productive capital, was insufficient due to the nature of the innovations. For example, the case of 5G is not only the expansion of the markets that is at stake there, but is also the velocity of capital rotation. The new technologies render morally obsolete the previous ones, without the time to fully depreciate the fixed capital of the old technical paradigms. The rapidity, the speed of the innovation had created such a tension in every single area of capital expansion, of accumulation. So monopolistic capital had created a historically new phenomenon in which the efforts to stop the commercial deployment of the innovations is much higher than the effort to the technical diffusion that accompany the recovery in the previous contractive waves. So this has created the target for Latin America this time in terms of the reduction of cost of constant capital, especially raw materials, and very strategic materials coming from Latin America. in terms of the prices in the international market. So the agenda of the Anglo-American elites has been during the last decades to build up the opportunity to provoke a macro deflation of our main exports, primary goods, strategic commodities, like oil, that is always the big vector in the Latin American U.S. relationships, and that is the main factor behind the offensive, the military offensive against Venezuela, but also lithium, and that is the reason behind the coup d'etat in Bolivia, but also gold and molybdenum and uranium, and that is part of the hidden agenda, because this is mostly secret information about the new horizon of mining in every country in Latin America, including Ecuador. So the new offensive, the new kind of expansion and redeployment of the military forces of the United States in Latin America has been very successful in a very short time due to this combination of economic measures with political measures in order to create in every country, according to the local correlation of forces, according to the political situation, in order to re-edit, to remake the cycle of Latin American dictatorships that you have during the 70s and the 70s, during the 60s and 70s under the Plan Condor, but this time with new possibilities, with new techniques, like those linked to the full spectrum dominance doctrine and the hybrid wars, or what Gene Sharp mentioned in terms of the velvet revolutions. And Latin America has been a kind of cadre of the new inventions, this type of social and political experiments that so far have been very successful, successful ones, with the maybe with the exceptions of Argentina and Mexico, with reformist governments, but under the pressures of the international markets, the geopolitical constraints, and the permanent blackmailing of the Anglo-American monopoly of transactionality, credit, and liquidity that expresses itself through the over-indebtment and the external restriction that reduces and suffocates the policy space in every one of the countries, precluding the possibility of a new wave of social reformist economic public policies. So that is, in general, the situation. The danger of a new military adventure in Venezuela is enormous. The continuation of the coup d'etat in every country, including taking advantage of the pandemic as the alibi to perpetuate dictatorships or restricted democracies in every one of the countries in order to preserve this extremist neoliberal agenda, is also omnipresent according to the political situations in every country. And the American promise of democracy and the institutionality has been totally disintegrated, even if the illusions of Pacific and democratic stability is still omnipresent among the progressive forces in Latin America. So that characterizes in general the situation of these latitudes. And I rather receive some questions in order to clarify the points in which you are more interested. Thank you.
All right, great. So just to reiterate for those who might have joined us a little bit later, any questions, comments, if you want to be more specific about interests, directions of where you'd like him to speak on, raise the hand icon in the chat. So again, you should find at the bottom of your screen on the bar, there should be participants or whatever the equivalent of participants is in your language. And by clicking on it, a screen will come up and you'll be able to raise your hand. There's a button there that says raise hand. I see we already had one hand raised by Leo Gabriel. So I don't know if he was just, were you testing it out or did you have a comment?
I have a question.
Great. So we'll start with that. Anyone else who has a question, then please raise your hand. We'll take note and we'll answer them in order. All right, go ahead, Leo.
Since you mentioned that this development which is going on, and I can confirm that from an analysis does not so much apply to Argentina and to Mexico. I got a very worrying information these last days that in Mexico, the President López Obrador somehow gave free access to his military to the major cities of Mexico City. Of course, always taking up with excuse the pandemia. And I wonder whether you know something about it, and if there is this is the second part of the question, is if there is a clear coordination among the armed forces of Latin America to say, today we are going to Venezuela, tomorrow we are going there, and whatever. Is there a sort of a compound behind all that?
Yeah, the question requires two answers. We need to separate two situations there. The first one is López Obrador has a very progressive agenda, but and as well as Alberto Fernández in Argentina, but the restrictions are much higher than what any other progressive government had to face during the previous 20 years. So it's not only the internal restrictions, it's also the geopolitical situation with respect to the barbarism of Trump, the offensive of Trump, regardless any legality, any institutionality, the open blackmailing of in any area of the Mexican policy. So as far as I can interpret, the under those circumstances, the very skillful management of the policy and the correlation of forces in Mexico has a meager result in terms of economic performance, because they do not have possibilities of expansive policies and redistributive policies other than the combat to corruption and the recovery of resources that are not insignificant in the case of Mexico, to deploy social policies. The situation of the military must be taken into account as a response, a very paradoxical response to the attempts of American imperialism, of the agenda of the Pentagon and the DEA to destroy the armed forces, the national armed forces in Mexico, and to take direct control of the situation there. Not against the cartels, but making business with the cartels. It's very difficult, especially for the left liberals and the left in Europe, in the civilized countries, to understand this. American government and NATO are part of the organized crime. And if you do not believe me, you can check out the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Organized Crime, and you can see where is the source of more than 95% of opium in the world. And you can see that is in Afghanistan, precisely in the areas that has been under American and British occupation during the last 2 decades. So as rapid and furious operation proved in the case of Mexico, and Trump is willing to open this case because of electoral reasons, with very deep effects both in the United States with respect to Democrats, especially Obama, and in the case of Mexico with respect to former President Calderon, that showed the direct complicity of the armed force and the secret services of the United States with the cartels in Mexico in order to manage the business of drug trafficking in the United States. So the situation of the army in Mexico is paradoxically linked to this dispute for very tiny spaces of sovereignty in the management of the Mexican territory that is at stake here. There are local forces in the north of Mexico, in the elites in the states in the north of Mexico, very prone to make alliances with this imperialist agenda of denationalization, not only of the natural resources, but also of the territory. So the challenge for the progressive government, AMLO progressive administration, are very dire. In the case of Argentina, the situation is a little bit different because it's farther from the frontier with the United States, but the restrictions in terms of economic policy are even deeper than in the case of Mexico. So the situation is, in terms of progressive policies, in terms of mere capitalist growth, not even think about redistribution, are very vulnerable. The second part of the answer, and then I'm going to be very, very, very short on this, is that you must understand today the situation of the armed forces in all Latin America, more related to the open program of the United States with Fort Braggs and the School of the Americas, and the direct control of the high commands and the middle commands of the armies during the 60s and the 70s, as I mentioned. Maybe today is the model is not an open Pinochet, but as a kind of Bordaberry, what happened in Uruguay. They need the fake institutionality of a civil government as a kind of coverage of the real military management. As can be seen in the case of Brazil, very clear, even with the contradictions and with important levels of dysfunctionality that could end up with the fall of Bolsonaro you have a very clear case of direct control of the military institutions under the disguise of democratic continuation.
All right, great, thank you. Our next question or comment is from Vendela. Vendela, are you there? I think you're muted. Okay,
Yeah,
there we go.
I'm muted. Good. Hello. Sorry. Can you reflect a bit more on the situation in Brazil and Brazilian military and the relation between the military and the Brazilian elite? So not the United States, but more the internal relationships there, because that's something I do not know much about, and probably you know a lot more than I do.
Again, I think it's important to differentiate between the bourgeoisie in general that has been losing at large in every country in Latin America, especially that bourgeoisie linked to the internal markets. The expansion of the internal markets make them thrive during these years, during the progressive years. And we need to understand the real role of this speculative elite. The transformation of Samir Amin's compradore bourgeoisie link anyway to the productive sector in Latin America, dependent, backward, deformed, underdeveloped, productive sector in Latin America, has been transformed in kind of speculative functionaries, linked to what Fidel called the imperial bourgeoisie, this kind of network of interest linked to the offshores, the shadow bankings, derivatives, today bitcoins and cryptocurrencies. The new platform of operation of anti-national operation of the capital accumulation in our countries. So is this elite, this crony capitalism, linked to the Anglo-American speculative apparatus that is very intimate related to the high commands of the military in Latin America. So it's a kind of convergence because institutionally the United States and the Pentagon, the military industrial complex, through the sales of weapons, had a permanent contact with the military in every one of the countries. Today, this has been challenged by the advances in technology, for example, in the case of Russia, that rendered totally inefficient all the inventories of armament in Latin America, as has been shown in the case of Venezuela and this episode of Iranian cargos reaching the coast of Venezuela under the impotent siege of NATO, because it's not only the United States, the European countries were also participants on this situation, especially the Netherlands, through Curaçao and Bel Air and all these, I don't know, paradisiac islands in the Caribbean are military bases in the military siege, in the offensive against Venezuela. But all this effort has been impotent due to the efficacy of the new armament that has been deployed, the Russian armament that has been deployed in Venezuela. This is not trivial nor anecdotal, because it shows the kind of expectations, the kind of challenges that every military has to face in the chess of, in this very multi-level chess of alliances, historical alliances and disputes among the leader nation states in Latin America. Anglo-American imperialism had deployed 2 centuries of diplomacy, of divide et impera. So every country has a history of grievances against every other country that could be triggered anytime to provoke conflicts, border conflicts among every country. And of course, everything is mastered and tailored by the Pentagon and the MI6 according to the conjunctural agenda. The main targets today are, of course, Venezuela, but also, unsuspectedly, Mexico. The migration policies have been part of blackmailing on behalf of Trump, conditioning the López Obrador administration in order to retain a little bit of policy space under those circumstances. So this contradiction between the elites and the Anglo-American agenda with the military, as I was trying to characterize in the previous answer, could have, mutatis mutandis, a replica in different countries in the continent. But the general structural situation is a total institutional and technological hegemony of the Pentagon over every single national army linked to this alliance of the parasitarian elites with the speculative Anglo-American apparatus. I don't know if that characterizes sufficiently in broader terms the situation.
All right, thank you. We have one hand up now from Rainer. Rainer, are you there?
Yes. You know, I have 2 questions. First of all, you were speaking about the US Army, and thank you for describing this more in detail. My question is, what do you think is the role of NATO? The new relations with Colombia and NATO, these partnership relations, and there is a discussion about new relations between Brazil and NATO. So this is the first part of my question. The second part is, maybe I doesn't hear it, but you don't mention China. What do you think is the role of China in this political strategic game in Latin America?
Pedro, you are muted.
Let's start from the last part of the question. China has a very contradictory situation. Obviously, what you have is an imperialist dispute in terms of capitals, but the term imperialism has been reflected upon, because today what you have is 2 different projects. On one hand, the Anglo-American hegemony in decline is bases its reproduction on this parasitarian hypertrophy of the speculative apparatus. Basically, linked to reprimarization of Latin America, especially in the most predatory mining in every country. We have lithium in not only in Bolivia, but also in Chile, in Argentina, copper in Chile, but also in Ecuador, and gold, and all this strategic hidden agenda of specific indispensable components of the new technological paradigm for the reindustrialization of the United States. That is one big part of the situation that opens the dispute with the productive capital project of China, or commanded by China, not only China, but commanded by China, over the natural resources in Latin America. In both cases, what you have is that industrialization in Latin America is out of the question. Out of the question. But you have, at least in the case of China, the need to open and to expand markets for the Chinese manufacturers, the overproduction of Chinese commodities upon Latin America. In the case of the Anglo-American project, you don't have this. There is no problem for the speculative capital endowment project to have degrowth in all Latin America. That is what is happening in Ecuador. Is a provoked crisis, is a reduction, a very crazy open reduction of GDP and regressive income distribution without any disguise. And upon these circumstances, the pandemic came as an alibi to justify everything, to justify regressive labor reform, to justify privatizations, to justify the most voracious appetites of the transnationals, not necessarily Chinese transnationals. So what you have is this big difference. In the case of the Chinese project, for example, to have a parallel with Africa, you have infrastructure construction all over the continent. The link of Africa, the connection of Africa, the inclusion of Africa, not only in Keynesian terms of public works, but also in the connection of the future of the Belt and Road Initiative that link Africa, that connected Africa to the Euro-Asian project. That is linked to the deployment of the new scientific revolution, the deployment of a huge horizon for the coming years of productive capital accumulation. In the case of Latin America, we have total deconnection with these circuits of productive capital and the re-edition of the external debt crisis. A very fast over-indebtment, very similar to what happened in the second half of the 70s. And those are basically linked to the Anglo-American interest. Again, linked to capital flights and there's a strategy of this new apparatus created by the conjunction of offshore banking, shadow banking, derivatives, financial derivatives, and cryptocurrencies. So what you have is basically these are the two basic motors of reproduction. It's ambiguous because China, opposite to what happened due to the geopolitical situation, for example, in Southeast Asia or Southwest Asia or Africa. In the case of Latin America, China always recognized the role of backyard of this continent to the United States. And they respected that situation and they play under the same rules. Even in terms, for example, when they gave a loan for our countries, in the case of Ecuador, for example, they accepted the same rules than the Anglo-American terms, which is not the same case of Africa. No, you have preferent loans, you link basically to development of infrastructure and integration of the productive apparatus in Africa. In the case of Latin America, you have more or less two big buyers under the same rules. Geopolitically, China never stand by the resistance of the progressive forces in any country. That explains the facility, the speed of the coup d'etat in every country, including Brazil. So these narratives of the two evils, the two imperialists, is a nefarious, and sorry, but I suspect, I very strongly suspect, I have very heavy evidence that a significant part of the leftist intellectuality had been buy up by this narrative of the two evils in order to justify which is unjustifiable. This left that involves indigenous movements, ecologist movements, trade unions, and other social movements, not all of them, of course, not all the critical left, not all the critical intellectuals, not all the social movements are under this category, but a significant part of these movements had a nefarious role in the agenda of the neoliberal extremism in Latin America. In this triangulation of the political consensus for the coup d'etat in Brazil, for the coup d'etat in Bolivia, supporting the bastardous government of Guaido, government between quotes of Guaido in Venezuela, and giving legitimacy to the invasion and the genocide programmed for Venezuela on behalf of NATO, or supporting, even from the opposition, the Macri government in Argentina. And please do not let me start with the situation of Ecuador. So under the campaign, the very efficient campaign of corruption, you have the alibi for anything. And you had there involved the historical diligence of the left, of the indigenous movement, of the ecologists from the trade unions, supporting the very extremist neoliberal, without precedent, neoliberal extremism of neoliberalism in Ecuador. So what you have in Ecuador and in Latin America is a new coalition, a very contradictory coalition in terms of the ideological offensive of the gene-sharp agenda of color revolutions, with the participation of important segments of the left, with the support of European NGOs, even the progressive NGOs have been supporting in every country this type of positions. And today, of course, as the situation has become so violent, I don't know what is the narrative that is going to support and to save face to this type of conditions. But one of the pillars of this narrative has been related to the supposedly dispute between the Chinese imperialism versus the Anglo-American imperialism.
All right, thank you. Our next question is from Peter.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your insightful and very clear presentation, of which I could not follow all the details. My question concerns the speculative capital. What can we do against it? How to link it to healthy and productive forces in balance with the ecology. And well, that's not on the Latin American continent, but in the European Union, we have Frans Timmermans. And at a meeting of the Dutch Academy of Sciences, he mentioned this new industrial revolution and scientific revolution that you talk about. Could you reflect on that, and that in a well, not a Green Deal for Latin America, but something in a more positive
I think it's
vision?
very realistic to. Yeah, I think is very pragmatic to think the possibility of a new social alliances, a new network of social alliances all around the world towards a progressive horizon. Unfortunately, that is not the current path of the situation. Everything has been a gain for the speculative elite. They have what they required previously. In other structural crises of overproduction, the remedy for the big capital has been massive destruction. The First and the Second World Wars are part of the solution, the capitalist solution to the structural crisis of overproduction and overaccumulation. Today, the pandemic is creating a massive bankruptcy of the small and medium size enterprises all over the countries, all over the world. But I don't know if this is enough to relaunch the economy. Besides those very heavy dystopic resources in terms of the capitalism of surveillance and the medical military dictatorship that has confined us 4 billion people in every country in this social experiment. They need to relaunch the economy upon the same underpinnings that they have been building up all this time. And those are mostly related to speculative capital, including those links to the big pharma and the monopoly and the dispute for the monopoly of the cure, between quotes, of this pandemic. So I'm not optimist about the type of new normality that the speculative apparatus is preparing for us. If there is no resistance and assertiveness on behalf of the progressive forces, this is not going to be possible. However, at the end of the day, if they want to deploy drop by drop this industrial revolution, they need markets. So it is imperative to have a new role for the state policies and the redistributive policies, because the differential macroeconomic capabilities that had been dramatically expressed during this crisis, during this pandemic, favoring, for example, the United States and the possibility of injecting trillions of dollars without any problem, versus the adjustment policies all over the South and even in Europe, the South of Europe, but also the global South, disguised by these humanitarian discourses and these narratives of goodwill everywhere, had rendered the competition, the monopolistic competition, very, very biased in favor of the countries that had macroeconomic autonomy. Of course, as it was mentioned, China, Russia, Iran, and every country with a little bit of autonomy, not only the rogue states, between quotes, but also South Korea, for example, could have an advantage under those circumstances. But the real possibility of taking advantage in a progressive terms of this this industrial revolution, because it's not only industrial, this is a scientific and technical revolution that could permeate every single aspect of the quotidian life, everyone in the world. Think about the 3D printer, for example, and the redefinition of technological dependency for the South. Think about the role of new materials and the flexible technologies and the quasi-zero margin cost of most of these technologies, and the adaptability of those technologies for relaunching of the not only the economy in the global South, but the economy in the South within the North. The possibilities are not only very wide, but very realistic. It is very possible to do this. Unfortunately, this is not a matter of technical capabilities, it's a matter of political will. It's a matter of the correlation of forces, but also is a matter of what Ryan Mills mentioned in terms of the sociological imagination, is a matter of the political imagination, is a matter of economics imagination. If the repertoire of alternatives is very narrow and is decided by the left wing of the speculative capital based upon London City and Wall Street, and the foundations that finance this type of NGOs and social movements, the possibilities for the humanity are in danger, are jeopardized, because even a pasteurized program of Green New Deal would require a massive policy, a kind of coordinated, massive efforts of redistribution, not only of income, but redistribution of infrastructure and capital and technology in order to democratize the technical progress. Otherwise, this is going to provoke a new normality in the worst of the terms. Even if, again, even if you have some little bit, how can I say, injections or some details of a new Green Deal as a part of legitimation, but also as a part of the valorization of capital. No, unfortunately, a big component of the most diffused proposal of the new Green Deal is related to carbon bonds and the financial and speculative infrastructure, even at the level of the United Nations, even at the level of the climate change and the endangered cities, the poorest urban conglomerates under the menace of inundations and floods with the global warming, have been lured by the possibility of investment, the very scarce resources, through bitcoins and hedge funds, for example. I've been witnessing this part of the situation. So again, in terms of possibility, we have plenty of options, of alternatives. In any case, it's indispensable to have local, regional, and global new financial architecture. We need to, for example, we need to fight at the global level for the issue of special growing rights in order to fund to compensate the aggression of Trump administration against World Health Administration, World Health Organization of the United Nations, in order to fund Food and Agriculture Organization of the United States, of the United Nations, in order to secure food security and health security all over the world. In order to prevent that all this situation is going to be monopolized by the speculative apparatus, we need to reinforce financial regulation. We need to reinforce the starving of offshores and shadow bankings, and we need to curb the explosion of financial derivatives. We need to control private cryptocurrencies, because if you don't have this type of measures coordinated all over the world, starting but not limited to the industrialized countries, you have chaos, and there's a very programmed, very profitable chaos that is going to favor precisely the Anglo-American speculative apparatus, even with these green overtones. At the regional level, we need to create the regulation that is going to render not only viable, but also profitable, productive accumulation, productive investments, instead of the financial and speculative investment. And in the case, for example, of the global South, especially Africa and South America, we need to deploy the institutional conditions that channeled all those resources that are humongous into the production, in the productive apparatus and the creation of jobs. Without this situation, nothing is going to spontaneously change the path that the speculative elites have created up today. And this, unfortunately, is going to sooner or later open the doors for more wars.
All right, thank you. We have about 15 minutes until we're closing here. We have another question from Rainer.
I want to follow the last words of Pedro and asking for the social forces or the social powers for changing. Let me say one sentence to that. We all, I think, had a lot of hope 10 or 15 years ago or 20 years ago to the progressive changes in Latin America. It was really a continent of hope. And the question is, what are the forces now which can lead again to a progressive way in Latin America? We see the huge demonstration in Chile. We see other activities. We see the change in Argentina. So what are the main forces? Above all, when you describe the role of non-governmental organizations in such a critical way, like you have done it, I'm really interested what you think are the social forces for changes.
Not only in Latin America, I think that worldwide the rebellion is there. The crisis of legitimacy of capitalism is latent in every country, and especially in Latin America, because with all the limitations, peoples in Latin America tasted the alternative, even within capitalism. Even with this very, very weak reformism, people knew the difference. And now, even if they were seduced by the narrative of corruption, the narrative of modernity, the cultivation of the worst angels of our human nature in terms of envy and the narcissistic menace that you have looking people that you used to have under you in social terms, in cultural terms, in symbolic terms, raising from their conditions. And the reaction of those, the convergence of this situation in terms of the ideological recovery of the right, of the new right, has burst so far. I think that in every country, even in Brazil, even in Bolivia, the possibility of continuing with those agendas of extreme neoliberalism had to rely more and more on repression, open repression. You need a kind of what Naomi Klein called the shock doctrine. You need this type of shocks, like the pandemic. You need to invent very horrendous crimes, like in Ecuador, the lawfare that included not only corruption against former President Rafael Correa, but they accused them and they convicted Correa of kidnapping. So, yeah, there is no limits there. No, you can accuse, you can fabricate every kind of situation in order to mess up with the minds of the population. I think that they are going to deploy every single trick as kind of psyops, military psyops. They are going to deploy this type of situations everywhere. The use of Protestantism, the evangelicals and Pentecostalism in Latin America has been very efficient in order to, as a kind of chains of transmission of this kind of psychological operations. But they are eating up their own discourse very rapidly, very, very fast. So what I think is that in terms of the population, not only in Latin America, the insurrection is there. Of course, with the restrictions of mobility and contact that we have, they had bought some time, but with as soon as the softening of the measures, like in the case of Chile, the case of Ecuador, create the possibility of mobilizations, people are in the streets again. And the same is happening in Colombia. The problem is that in Colombia, for example, you have every day the assassination of a social leader. Without any response of the media, without any response of the academia, without any response of the so-called international community. What is different this time, and this is why I insist that what I'm proposing is very realistic, is that very significant segments of capital, even monopolistic capital, are recognizing right now they are losing, that this horizon is suicidal for them. I'm thinking in the case of Latin America, we are talking about, for example, in the case of Ecuador, we have a duplication of the internal market. And this is not for profit of the cooperatives and the indigenous communities. This is a business opportunity for small, medium, and large size for the relative to the scale of the Ecuadorian economy enterprises. And I think it's the same in every country. For example, in the case of Europe, the process of centralization of capital, the monopolization of capital that has been the strategy so far, has disgruntled a significant segment of the local capitals, even monopolistic capitals. And that is the expression of this is the raising of what you call right-wing populism, the local nationalistic expressions are part of these dissidence with respect to the core of the speculative capital. And even in the case of the United States, Trump is expression of this dissidence, is a systemic expression of this. And I'm thinking about the obsolescence of the decline of the hegemony of this right-wing game within the core of the neoliberal establishment. This is going to disintegrate very rapidly, among other things because free trade, between quotes, as we know, is over, is totally over. The financial war, the commercial war, the technological war, the currency war is going to continue under more open medias, even during the quarantine. The confrontation between the United States and China is not unique. Is a very silent dispute between the intimate partners of NATO right now in commercial and technological terms. The main dispute, for example, related to the cure, the monopoly of the cure and the patent between the United States and France and Germany, for example. And this is just a by-side of the situation with respect to the airlines, with respect to the military market, with respect to 5G, with respect to artificial intelligence, with respect to, well, every single frontier in this scientific and technological revolution. So again, the horizon of outcomes is open. And paradoxically, even if they are winning every single battle so far, it is very, very realistic to deploy a rapid initiative for a progressive coalition that include important segments of monopolistic productive capital. And I think that is the real key of a political and social strategy, to understand that the only possibility, not because I am a communist, not because I'm a Koreist, or I am a Chavist, but in objective terms, any possibility of commercial, of capitalistic deployment of the scientific and technological revolution require markets. And in order to have markets, you have to reverse this tendency to social polarization. You need to create explicit interventions, public interventions in terms of income redistribution, in terms of social policies, in terms of decommodification of health care, decommodification, pay attention to this, decommodification of food security. So this is the immediate challenge that we have to face. It's a very silent situation, but the global logistics of food provision, especially in the South, in the global South, are in jeopardy right now. And in terms of logistics and with the external sector restriction, with the balance of payment restrictions, going deeper and deeper every day that we have this confinement, the crises are going to multiply next month. The external deficit and the fiscal deficit are sharpening as we are talking in every single country without policy space, like what you have in the United States. In the case of Europe, those are much more not only mature economies, but even within the restrictions of this relaxed Maastricht horizon, you can manage to save the day. But in the case of Latin America, the situation is critical.
Great, thank you. We have just a couple minutes left, and I see one more hand raised, so this will be the last question coming from Nuri. And then we're just a couple minutes before the end time here, so yeah, it's up to you how long you want to go on with your answer, but we'll at least give Nuri the floor for the question now.
Okay, Pedro, what do you think would be the effect of corona pandemic after this on a progressive movement as well as on imperialism, the divide? What would be?
Well, it's a huge challenge, but the immediate impact, and we have to build up upon this situation, is the very clear a contradiction between life and capital. It is a day-to-day, very pedagogical school for the people to see which are, and that is part of the tasks of the progressive forces, to show and to decode to the population the intrinsic nature of this antisocial nature of capital, especially speculative and monopolistic capital. So we need to build up agendas from the social grassroots organizations, from the left-wing scholars, from the intellectuals, from the professionals in every single technical aspect of the everyday life. With respect to health security, for example, we need to have our agenda and how to build up the new normality, respecting and building up social rights for the people, labor rights, and opposing this very sharp offensive, this blitzkrieg against labor rights everywhere. In the case of Ecuador, they had destroyed 80 years of labor rights embedded in the legislation with a couple of decrees under the alibi of the pandemic. But the same is happening with respect to every aspect of social life. I alert you, I warn you about the food crisis that is going to, unfortunately, it's very possible to be triggered in several countries, very, very near in the future. So we have to deploy this type of initiatives, which are the more efficient and overarching measures related to this. For example, debt jubilee, to stop paying the debt in every country. This is going to provoke a lot of policy space in terms of emergency, a huge and a worldwide campaign for debt forgiveness, for debt moratorium, is any type of formulation is going to have a very synergic effects in every country, because this is going to amalgamate a constellation of forces locally that are going to have very significant echoes at the global level. Debt forgiveness, the issue of special drawing rights, the possibility of escaping the monopoly of the dollar on liquidity, transactionality, credit, all world and at the global level, but also at the regional level, could be part of this alliance that includes parts of the bourgeoisie, parts of the elites that are that had their own subsistence at stake right now. It's not an ideological situation. So this is a kind of bifurcation. This is a historical bifurcation. We could have at the same time the worst of the outcomes, but also we could have a qualitative jump in terms of the new stability, the new constellation of forces of interclass alliance that could be deployed worldwide, taking advantage of the scientific and technical revolution. The lucidity and the assertiveness of the proposals from the left, from the progressive movements is crucial here. If we are silent, or if we subordinate it to our demands to the agenda of the right or left branches of speculative capital, we are doomed. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Páez. Thank you everyone who has tuned in. Some have already left. To those who haven't, I'll let you know we will be uploading the recording of this to our YouTube channel, and we'll send it out to all of you as well. So once again, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your days, nights, whatever time it is.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Un abrazo.
Thank you. Un abrazo.
Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. Chao.